Meet Mark Lawson, a 54-year-old farmer from Nebraska who built his business from the ground up. He's not just any farmer, he's a logistics mastermind, supplying fresh produce across 8 states. But when he walks into a luxury jet showroom in dusty boots and a flannel shirt, the salesman laughs, assuming he's in the wrong place. What happens next? Let's just say the salesman won't be laughing for long, because Mark isn't here to window shop. If you love underdog stories and shocking twists, hit subscribe now. More incredible stories are coming soon. The sun had barely risen over Denver Executive Airport, casting a golden glow on the sleek, polished jets lined up inside the private hangar. The lot was filled with luxury sports cars and blacked-out SUVs, the kind of vehicles owned by millionaires and corporate executives. Yet, amidst all this wealth, a dusty Ford F-250 pickup rumbled to a stop. The driver's side door creaked open, and out stepped Mark Lawson, a 54-year-old farmer from Nebraska, dressed in worn-out jeans, a flannel shirt, and mud-caked boots. As he strode forward, he could feel the curious glances from the well-dressed men nearby. Some barely hid their amusement, others dismissed him without a second thought. Mark had seen this look before, the look of doubt, the unspoken assumption that a man like him didn't belong in a place like this. He didn't look like a man who could afford a jet. But looks can be deceiving. Mark wasn't here to admire the aircraft or take a tour, he was here to buy. And not just for status or luxury. No, Mark had a plan, one that would change the future of his business forever. He adjusted his baseball cap, inhaling the crisp morning air mixed with the scent of jet fuel and fresh-cut grass. With every step toward the showroom, his boots crunched against the pavement, a stark contrast to the soft footsteps of the suited professionals inside. At the reception desk, a young salesman, Ryan Whitmore, glanced up from his laptop. His polished appearance, a perfectly tailored suit, crisp white shirt, and designer watch, screamed professionalism. His expression, however, shifted the moment he laid eyes on Mark. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation. Ryan's gaze dropped to Mark's boots, then traveled up to his calloused hands and faded flannel. The smirk was almost imperceptible, but Mark caught it. "Good morning, sir," Ryan said, his voice politely dismissive. "How can I help you today?" Mark didn't hesitate. He met Ryan's skeptical gaze, his voice steady. "I'm here to buy a jet." The room went silent. And then Ryan laughed. Ryan Whitmore's laugh wasn't loud, it was the kind of chuckle meant to be polite, yet still dripping with disbelief. It lasted only a second, but in that moment, it told Mark everything he needed to know. Ryan didn't see a serious buyer standing in front of him. He saw a man out of place, someone who had wandered into the wrong world. The amusement in his eyes was thinly veiled, his expression caught between condescension and forced professionalism. Mark had seen that look 100 times before, from bankers who didn't believe a farmer could handle big money, from corporate executives who dismissed his handshake, from business partners who assumed his success was luck rather than strategy. He had spent a lifetime proving people wrong, and today would be no different. His hands, weathered from decades of work, curled into tight fists at his sides before he forced himself to relax. No need for anger. Patience was more powerful than pride. Ryan cleared his throat, shifting back into salesman mode. "You're here to buy a jet," he repeated, this time his voice controlled, careful. "And what, exactly, would you be using it for?" Mark didn't flinch. "Business." Ryan's eyebrows arched slightly. "Business?" he echoed, skepticism creeping into his tone. "May I ask what kind?" Mark took a slow breath. He could correct Ryan's assumptions right now. He could drop the numbers, the contracts, the distribution routes, but why waste the surprise? Instead, he just nodded. "A big one." The vague response only seemed to amuse Ryan further. "Right," he said, adjusting his perfectly pressed cuffs. "Well, our jets cater to a very specific clientele." Mark tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his own eyes now. Ryan still didn't get it. And that was fine. Because by the time they were done, by the time Ryan knew the truth, the salesman wouldn't be smirking anymore. No, by the end of this conversation, he'd be scrambling to make a deal. And Mark? Mark would be the one deciding whether or not to shake his hand. Ryan exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping absently on the polished counter. He wasn't quite laughing anymore, but the skepticism was still there, buried beneath the carefully crafted mask of salesman professionalism. He had entertained plenty of time-wasters before, wealthy men who liked to browse, dreamers who wanted to feel important, and now, apparently, farmers who thought they could buy a jet. "All right," Ryan said, forcing a smile. "Well, Mr. Lawson," Mark supplied. Ryan nodded, as if committing the name to memory, though he clearly didn't expect to need it for long. "Mr. Lawson, let's take a walk through the showroom. I'd be happy to show you our options." Mark followed as Ryan led him toward a row of gleaming aircraft, their exteriors reflecting the morning sun like polished silver and pearl. The hangar's towering ceiling loomed above them, the distant hum of jet engines filling the space like an ever-present reminder that this was a world of power, speed, and money. And Ryan didn't think Mark belonged in it. The salesman walked with the effortless confidence of a man used to dealing with executives, CEOs, and billionaires, not a guy who had probably spent his morning feeding cattle and hauling equipment. Every step he took, every word he spoke, was measured, carefully neutral, yet laced with an unspoken assumption: this guy isn't serious. He's wasting my time. Mark let him believe it. They stopped in front of a sleek Falcon 2000, its streamlined design radiating wealth and prestige. Ryan turned to face him, crossing his arms. "This jet seats 8 comfortably," he began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "It has top-of-the-line luxury features, including custom leather interiors, a state-of-the-art navigation system, and—" "I'm not flying passengers," Mark interrupted, his tone calm, but unyielding. Ryan blinked. "Excuse me?" "I'm not flying executives," Mark repeated. "I'm transporting fresh produce." Ryan's face froze mid-expression, his carefully curated salesman's confidence momentarily cracking. "Produce," he repeated, as if the word physically didn't belong in the same sentence as "private jet." Mark let the silence stretch between them before delivering the next blow. "I run one of the largest independent agricultural distribution networks in the Midwest." Ryan swallowed. His smirk was completely gone now. "And Mark?" Mark was just getting started. Ryan's posture shifted ever so slightly. It was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation, a slight tightening of his jaw, but Mark caught it. That was the moment. The moment Ryan realized he had underestimated the wrong man. Still, the salesman wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He forced a chuckle, though it didn't carry the same confidence as before. "Produce," he repeated, his tone hovering between disbelief and forced politeness. "That's unconventional." Mark met his gaze without blinking. "So is assuming a man's net worth by the dirt on his boots." Ryan didn't respond. He just pressed his lips together, shifting slightly on his polished dress shoes. For the first time since Mark had stepped into the showroom, Ryan wasn't sure what to say next. Mark let the silence hang between them before continuing, his voice even, deliberate. "I run Lawson Farms, supplying fresh produce, dairy, and livestock to 8 states. Our network stretches from Chicago to Dallas, and every day, our shipments move across the country by truck and freight." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But ground transport has its limits." Ryan cleared his throat, regaining some of his composure. "I see," he said, though it was clear he didn't. "Not yet. And you believe a private jet is the answer?" Mark allowed himself a small smile, not of arrogance, but of certainty. "I don't believe," he corrected. "I know." Ryan hesitated, and Mark could tell he was calculating. Doing the math in his head. Still, there was resistance. "Mr. Lawson," Ryan started, his voice careful, "these jets aren't designed for cargo. They're built for business executives, for corporate travel. You'd need serious modifications." "I'm aware," Mark said smoothly. "And I'm prepared to invest in them." Ryan exhaled, the fight leaving his posture bit by bit. He wasn't dismissing Mark anymore. He was re-evaluating him. Mark had seen this transformation before, the shift in attitude when people realized they had misjudged him. It never got old. Still, there was one last battle to win. Because Ryan wasn't just doubting the jet purchase anymore. He was starting to doubt himself. Ryan exhaled slowly, his polished demeanor slipping as the weight of Mark's words settled in. He glanced at the Falcon 2000 beside them, its sleek, silver body reflecting the morning light. For the first time, he wasn't seeing luxury, he was seeing potential. But Ryan was a salesman. He knew how to regain control of a conversation, how to steer things back into familiar waters. And right now, he wasn't ready to admit he had misjudged Mark. "Mr. Lawson," he started, shifting his stance, "even with modifications, this is a high-performance business jet. It's not a cargo plane. And honestly, moving fresh produce by air." He let out a soft chuckle, though this time, it lacked confidence. "I've just never heard of that before." Mark didn't flinch. "That's because no one else is thinking ahead." Ryan frowned, his sales instincts kicking in. "Trucking works," he pointed out. "Freight works. Why not stick with what's proven?" Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to force Ryan to listen. "Because what's proven," he said, "isn't always what's best." Ryan hesitated. Mark pressed on. "Every hour a shipment sits on the road, it loses freshness, quality, and value. Ground transport means delays, breakdowns, traffic, weather issues. Every year, farmers lose millions of dollars on spoiled or damaged goods because they're stuck waiting on logistics. I'm not here to follow the pack." His voice hardened. "I'm here to lead it." The words hit harder than Ryan expected. He had been so focused on what Mark looked like, he had never stopped to think about what Mark actually knew. A long silence stretched between them. Ryan finally swallowed, adjusting his tie. He was rattled. This wasn't some wide-eyed dreamer standing in front of him, this was a man with a vision. And suddenly, Ryan realized something: Mark Lawson wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them how this was going to go. Ryan licked his lips, forcing a nod. "All right," he murmured. "Say you go through with this. Say you get the modifications, the logistics, the routing figured out." He exhaled, tilting his head. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Mark's eyes gleamed. "Revolutionize an industry." And for the first time since Mark had walked into that showroom, Ryan believed him. Ryan's carefully constructed confidence was cracking, and Mark could see it. The salesman had walked into this conversation assuming he was humoring a lost farmer, a man who didn't belong in this world of high-powered executives and private aviation. But now, Ryan was leaning in, his expression no longer amused, but curious, and maybe a little nervous. Still, he wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and folded his arms as if reasserting control. "All right," he said, his tone measured. "You've got my attention." Mark smirked. "About time." Ryan shifted on his feet. "You're telling me that instead of trucking, you're going to start flying fresh produce across the country?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Mark replied without hesitation. Ryan let out a short breath, shaking his head. "I'll be honest, Mr. Lawson, this isn't the kind of deal we see every day." Mark's expression didn't change. "That's because you're used to selling luxury," he said. "I'm here to buy efficiency." Ryan glanced at the jet beside them, the Falcon 2000, its pristine body gleaming under the showroom lights. It was designed for CEOs, politicians, high-profile clients, not a farmer moving crates of lettuce, dairy, and beef. And yet, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't crazy. Ryan hesitated, then exhaled. "All right," he muttered, rubbing his jaw. "If you're serious, we'll need to talk modifications, cargo flooring, refrigeration, weight distribution. You'd need custom fittings, temperature controls." Mark nodded, completely unfazed. "I've already got a logistics team running numbers. I'm not just here to browse." His voice hardened. "I'm here to buy." Ryan blinked, the final realization hitting him. This wasn't a dreamer with an idea, this was a man with a plan. For the first time, Ryan wasn't the one leading the conversation anymore. Mark was. And as the weight of that shift settled in, Ryan finally understood. This wasn't some wild idea from a naive farmer. This was a game-changing move from a man who had spent his entire life proving people wrong. Ryan stood there, hands on his hips, his mind racing. Just minutes ago, he had assumed this was a waste of time, a farmer in dirty boots walking into a showroom meant for millionaires and executives. But now, he was recalculating everything. Mark Lawson wasn't some naive outsider playing pretend in the world of private jets. He was a strategist, a man who had spent decades outthinking obstacles and outworking doubters. Ryan could see it now, the same sharpness, the same unstoppable drive that had built Mark's business from the ground up. And suddenly, it hit him. Mark wasn't here to ask if this was possible. He was here to make it happen. Ryan took a slow breath, glancing at the Falcon 2000 beside them, then back at Mark. His expression softened, the last of his doubt slipping away. "All right," he said, his voice lower now. "I believe you." Mark gave a small nod, almost as if he had expected this all along. Ryan hesitated, then extended a hand. "If we're doing this, I want to make sure we do it right." Mark looked at the outstretched hand for a moment before gripping it firmly. His handshake was steady, unwavering, just like the man himself. As their hands locked, Ryan let out a breath of something that felt suspiciously like respect. "I'll connect you with our modifications team," he said, finally dropping the last of his earlier skepticism. "We'll get everything customized to your needs." Mark nodded. "Good," he said simply. Ryan shook his head with a small chuckle. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" Mark smiled. "I never had that luxury." And in that moment, Ryan realized that Mark Lawson wasn't just here to buy a jet. He was here to prove a point. To every banker who had once refused him a loan. To every executive who had dismissed his handshake. To every person who had ever looked at him and assumed he was less than what he was. This wasn't just a purchase. It was a statement. And Ryan was just lucky to be part of it. As the final handshake settled between them, Ryan felt something shift, not just in the conversation, but within himself. The doubts, the dismissiveness, the unspoken assumptions, they were all gone. Mark Lawson had come into this showroom looking out of place, but now, standing beside the gleaming Falcon 2000, he owned the moment. Ryan cleared his throat, composing himself. "All right, Mr. Lawson," he said, finally speaking with real respect, "let's talk logistics. You'll need reinforced flooring, cargo restraints, refrigeration. We'll have to modify weight distribution so your produce stays fresh without compromising flight efficiency." Mark nodded, arms crossed, listening intently. "I expected that. I'll need specs on turnaround times, fuel efficiency, and maintenance costs. My team's already running profit projections, I need numbers to match." Ryan almost laughed, not in disbelief this time, but at his own misjudgment. An hour ago, he had thought this man was completely out of his depth. Now, he saw exactly why Mark Lawson was standing here. Ryan turned toward the Falcon 2000, running a hand along its polished surface. He had spent years selling jets to CEOs, investors, and celebrities, men who saw these aircraft as status symbols, extensions of their wealth. But Mark saw a tool. A weapon. A game changer. And suddenly, Ryan realized something else. This jet, the one he had tried to sell as a luxury item, was about to become something far more valuable, a revolution. Ryan let out a slow breath, nodding. "I'll bring in our customization lead. We'll go over everything in detail." He glanced back at Mark. "You're really about to change the industry, aren't you?" Mark smirked. "That's the plan." Ryan shook his head, still marveling at how wrong he'd been. "You ever get tired of proving people wrong?" Mark chuckled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Not yet." Ryan exhaled, stepping aside as Mark took one final look at the jet, his jet. And in that moment, Ryan wasn't doubting him anymore. He was just wondering why no one else had thought of this first. Never let the world define you by appearances. Never let assumptions shape your future. Mark Lawson walked into that jet showroom, knowing exactly who he was, a man who had built something from nothing, who had spent a lifetime proving doubters wrong. He didn't let a salesman's smirk shake his confidence. He didn't let society's expectations dictate his worth. He walked in with a plan, and he walked out with a game-changing investment, not just in his business, but in his own vision of success. Now, think about your own life. How many times have you been underestimated? Laughed at? Looked down on because you didn't fit the mold of what success is supposed to look like? How many doors have been closed before you even had the chance to knock? The truth is, the world will doubt you. People will assume, dismiss, and categorize you before you even open your mouth. That's their mistake. But here's the real lesson: it's not your job to convince them. It's your job to prove them wrong. And how do you do that? You stay the course. You build your skills. You invest in your vision. You put in the work, not for their approval, but for your own future. You don't waste time arguing with those who doubt you, you let your results speak for themselves. Because, in the end, success isn't about who believes in you at the start. It's about who can't ignore you at the finish line. Mark didn't let a laughing salesman define him. He let his achievements do the talking. And that's exactly what you need to do. So whatever dream you're chasing, whatever goal seems just out of reach, don't stop now. Keep going. Keep pushing. Keep showing up in places they say you don't belong, because, sooner or later, they won't be able to deny you. And when they finally see who you are, they won't be laughing anymore. As Mark Lawson walked out of the showroom, the crisp morning air hit him, carrying the distant hum of jet engines. But he wasn't thinking about the aircraft. He was thinking about every person who had ever doubted him. The bankers who refused to lend him money because a small-town farmer wasn't a safe investment. The business executives who ignored his handshake at meetings, assuming he was just another supplier. The competitors who laughed when he first expanded beyond Nebraska, believing he'd never make it. And now, he had just secured a private jet, not for luxury, but to revolutionize his business. A farmer, a man who had spent his life covered in dust, sweat, and calluses, had just walked into the world of high-stakes corporate aviation and claimed his space. Ryan Whitmore, the salesman who had laughed at him minutes ago, now stood in the doorway, watching him leave with a mix of respect and regret. He had misjudged Mark, just like so many before him. And Mark knew something else, too. Somewhere out there, another young entrepreneur, another dreamer, another fighter was being underestimated, dismissed, and ignored. But if they kept pushing, kept showing up, kept proving people wrong, one day, they would have their moment, just like this one. Because success doesn't belong to those who fit the mold. It belongs to those who break it. So the next time you feel overlooked, doubted, or laughed at, remember Mark Lawson. Remember that it's not about how they see you, it's about what you do next. And when your moment comes, make sure they remember you. If you love powerful stories of resilience and success, hit that subscribe button now. More inspiring stories like this are coming soon on X Daily Stories, because sometimes, the best success stories start with being underestimated. Don't miss out, your next favorite story is just a click away.